All right, we're live. Let me go ahead and do a screen share of some of the notes.
All right.
Um, all right, so this in this review of Chapter 1 of Sublime Object of Ideology, we're doing parts 4, 5, and 6. So that's commodity, fetishism, totalitarian laughter, and what is it? Cynicism as a
Cynicism.
form of ideology.
Yes.
Um, I'm with my recent review, I've been kind of trying to integrate some of the things I learned from some of the other books, especially the For They Know Not What They Do, because ZIZEK says that's he corrected a bunch of things in the new book, and I know that Mark and the guys from the podcast from the Partially Examined Life, they they try to stay in the text that you're actually reading.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm fine with doing that. But there's some things that I think that you might enjoy or find useful, Miel. So
Yeah, definitely. I'd definitely be interested in hearing some of the insights from the other text. I mean, in particular, these three sections were interesting because we kind of move out of the Freudian psychoanalytic register and into thinking in the terms that I think Zizek himself is most comfortable thinking in. He kind of, gets to do some brief literary analysis. He makes some allusions to some different texts and various cultural artifacts. So that was a fascinating turn. But he of course starts outlining, talking specifically about Marx and outlining commodity fetishism.
right, right. And so I might want to let you lead a little bit, I mean, if you want, or I can, either one.
No. I mean, I don't mind. Thinking about, so we have on page 19 towards the top, in a first approach, commodity fetishism is a definite social relation between men that assumes in their eyes the fantastic form of a relation between things. So essentially, what we get in this passage is the idea of commodity fetishism being necessarily subtended by the idea of the kind of rational agent, the one who, so then this goes, he kind of outlines the expression of commodity fetishism and how Marx uses the analogy to human beings. At the bottom of page 19, he's quoting Marx in a sort of way, it is with man as with commodities. Since he comes into the world neither with a looking glass in his hand, nor as a Fichtean philosopher, to whom I is sufficient, man first sees and recognizes himself in other men. So then Zizek goes on to make the comment that I think any reader of Lacan, it's immediately apparent to them that this is kind of analogous to the mirror stage. But what's important about all of this analysis of the relationships between humans and the relationships between commodities is that the idea that under capitalism relationships between humans are demystified in a certain way. So this is on page 21. Commodity fetishism occurs in capitalist societies, but in capitalism relations between men are definitely not fetishized. What we have here are relations between free, in air quotes, people, each following his or her proper egoistic interest. He goes on and says, the predominant and determining form of their interrelation is not domination and servitude, but a contract between free people who are equal in the eyes of the law. A little more, they meet as two persons whose activity is thoroughly determined by their egoistic interest. Every one of them proceeds as a good utilitarian. So part of how this, in my view, kind of links to the earlier argument that we discussed last week is the fact that what's getting exposed in this sort of symptomatic way is that, in fact, the relationships between humans themselves are not necessarily defetishized in a certain way. So then we get this at page 22. The relations of domination and servitude are repressed. Formally, we are apparently concerned with free subjects whose interpersonal relations are discharged of all fetishism. The repressed truth, that of the persistence of domination and servitude, emerges in a symptom which subverts the ideological appearance of equality, freedom, and so on. This symptom, the point of emergence of the truth about social relations, is precisely the social relation between things. Then he goes on, he quotes Marx a bit. Instead of appearing at all events as their own mutual relations, the social relations between individuals are disguised under the shape of social relations between things. And then that's the end of the quote. Here we have a precise definition of the hysterical symptom, of the hysteria of conversion proper to capitalism.
All right. So one thing ZIZEK, I think, is trying to point out is that there's a normal, intuitive view of what the commodity fetish is. And then I think, like what you were saying, his spin, or I think his idea of what Lacan is saying, is the misrecognition is what allows the fetish to. It's the structure of the fetish. The symptom itself and the misrecognition is what allows it to have any type of substance or have control, and that's what ideology is. Here he has, or he's the way that he's describing fetish. Like you said, there's a piece of it where it's the relationship, it's hidden, belief, or it's masked under the relationship between things. And I think he kind of, like, he continuously reiterates that misrecognition is what allows the, like, capitalism and other types of ideologies to have any form. That's what ideology looks like. It's the form of ideology. Mm-hmm. And he talks a little bit more in the next portion. That one interesting thing is, like, when he says fetishistic inversion. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's not like just a fetish, it's an inverted fetish. Mm-hmm. That's kind of peculiar because I don't know. Like, he gives a description, and one of the this here is where I think that he expounded on it in the next book. Okay. He has 3 types of fetish in the next book. And if you've ever you've heard him talk, he kind of uses these different types of fetishes. And I talked about this in the last one, but the kind of form of fetishes I know, but nevertheless, that way of describing it is it's a little different than how he's describing it here, where he uses Lacan's description of, it's basically a fetish is when, and kind of like almost like a popular view of fetishes, when someone looks at some type of item, could be a human, so a king, right? And they give it some power that it doesn't normally have. So a king that actually believes that biologically they have some type of property that makes them king, they're a madman. Mm-hmm. Okay? And but really what allows them to be king is the subjects. The subjects, because they believe he's a king, then or she, or he, not she, but or queen, that makes them a king.
Right.
He kind of changes that a little bit in the next, and it relates to the next portion with the cynicism as the new kind of ideology. So maybe I'll hold off a bit, but there's 3 modes of fetish, which to me, explain some of how the back and forth is going along in these three portions. And there's three forms of, with those three forms of fetish, there's three forms of authority that go with those. And I'm sorry, I don't have the mind map written up. I have it hand drawn, but it makes a whole lot more sense to me when I'm looking at it. But we can go on to the next portion if you want, or.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of this thinking about totalitarian laughter, the title of the next section, so that kind of is sort of, I guess it seems like the totalitarian laughter and the cynicism as a form of ideology, well, they're not chapters, the sections, work together to sort of elucidate particular aspects of how Marx is thinking about as he says, the dialectics of commodity fetishism. So he starts out in Totalitarian Laughter talking about Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose, which Zizek, I guess, has a very poor opinion of the novel's ideological frame, at the very least, if not the novel itself. He, says there's something wrong with this book, very matter-of-factly. And so, he kind of has this digression about structuralism. It's not really super important to the broader argument, but mostly that in this section, I don't know if I'm really misreading it, but it almost seems like we get like the kind of idealist, like passionate activist version of Zizek, where he says basically, I mean, you could summarize the entire section thinking about that comment on page 24, where he says, in contemporary societies, democratic or totalitarian, that cynical distance, laughter, irony are, so to speak, part of the game. The ruling ideology is not meant to be taken seriously or literally. Perhaps the greatest danger for totalitarianism is people who take its ideology literally. So you have the novel that he's referring to here as endorsing a kind of subversive irony and ironic distance. And Zizek's counterpoint is, no. This idea of irony and cynical distance, these are part of what make ideology function, what makes democratic or totalitarian societies function. And that ties into what he says, in the subsequent section, where he's talking about the fact that you can't simply pull back the curtain, really, insofar as we're concerned with this argument, that we can't simply point at the symptom, that in fact these ideologies have built into themselves a way for the people who are organized under these ideological principles to ignore the symptom.
Right. So, and I do think the structuralist part is important, because he kind of points that out, at least once or twice in every book. He has a position on structuralism, which is, structuralism only kind of had a influence for a very short time, and then post-structuralism came in and kind of like just started dominating. And he really thinks that our or most people's view of structuralism is not not the strongest position for structuralism. He thinks that when you say that structuralism is, the meaning of it is that there's no final reality, or a kind of like what he says here, a spaghetti structuralism is a kind of simplified mass culture version of the structuralist and post-structuralist idea. There's no final reality. We all live in a world of signs referring to other signs. Well, he tries to have a more sophisticated view of what structuralism is, and he doesn't go in, like you said, he doesn't go in complete detail, but the totalitarian laughter and saying that having an ironic detachment is the sign of totalitarianism, like what you said. He he's disagreeing with that at all, and it's also that's specifically part of totalitarian. And then, I guess for whoever's listening, when we say totalitarianism, sometimes, I mean, that word can, people can lose it's kind of ambiguous. So I believe that when ZIZEK is saying totalitarianism, he's described it as just when the public and the private aren't free. So your private life is also governed by some type of law or what have you, thought police kind of thing. And when there's no ironic detachment, he's saying, "Oh yeah, that's the Echo's version of totalitarian is when there's no, ironic distance and all that." And then he gets into, so it's kind of a back and forth thing, and then he gets into, oh no, it's part of the game. Mm-hmm. And like you said, I think also there's another theme here. ZIZEK likes to talk about evil in the service of good and good in the service of evil. So, when he says here, the enlightened religious belief is a dogmatic attachment to good, and that's a bad thing, because sometimes you're going to overlook, ends justify the means and all this other stuff and that type of thing. And he says, well, what about when the other side, where you can have a dogmatic attachment to evil, and then that can be a force for good? So he uses Don Giovanni as an example of this, and that's when he is kind of going back to his belief with Freud, where he's saying where you can be pathological driven, or the drives are controlling you. Where's the space for an altruism? Mm-hmm. And Don Giovanni's altruism is paradoxical, because he's saying, if you just admit these sins, you can have salvation. And Don Giovanni says, no, I'm going to go ahead and that would be according to the pleasure principle. I'm going to go ahead and say no and stay true to my own ideals. And then that would be, even though on the great balance or utilitarian view, that would be, you should go ahead and admit your sin. He says no. In some way, that altruism and everything, that's in line with a great, like an altruism, a greater form. It's in line with like Immanuel Kant's, categorical imperative and all kinds of other things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I on that point, again, this is a little bit of a digression outside of the text, but thinking about, Lacan is very invested in thinking about, Kant with Sade, and then commentators who have kind of taken that up, notably Alenka Zuponcic, who wrote very lucidly about kind of the idea that, and then, filtered through Lacan, that what Kant sets up as a categorical imperative, that if you were to kind of expand Sade's, mm-hmm. if he has an ethical structure mm-hmm. in the narratives, that they adhere to the categorical imperative, that in fact, if you can do anything to anyone else's body and anyone can do anything to my own body, that kind of idea, I'm certainly oversimplifying and bastardizing this formulation, but the point being that, again, this thing that Zizek is getting at is something also that Lacan has thought about, and that other commentators on Lacan have thought about, that as you say, certain formal structures of ethics, particularly Kant's categorical imperative, make a space for, as you say, evil in the service of good. So there's other examples that are very similar to the Don Giovanni example that Zizek uses.
Yeah, and I guess to go more than like to 10,000 foot view, that pleasure principle part of Freud, like as long as you have some kind of base to say humans, like if they behaved in this utilitarian fashion, if they accounted for all the goods and evils, or the goods and bads and all this stuff like that, there's a way that they would act, and that would be like according to this pleasure principle. But we see that they don't do that sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And when they don't do that, that's when I think the Kants and like ZIZEK and all that, they find that very interesting. And that's where a space for altruism. I think there's also a space for this diabolical evil thing he talks about sometimes. I don't know. But it's in that sense, I think that it's a good tool to try to talk about with ethics and all that. That's why people are fascinated with it.
Yeah.
So I guess the next section, with the cynicism as a form of ideology.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you want to go over it again.
Oh, well, just basically that this section seems to kind of expand. He says at the end of the last section on page 24, perhaps it would be better first to try to specify what we mean by ideology. So he wants to kind of expand on the criticism he's making of the ideological formation in Eco's novel, where he basically says that there's a certain way that the mystifying nature of ideology, that the kind of fetishistic nature of ideology becomes a part of ideology. So it makes an allusion to the Frankfurt School, and he says on page 25 that it is not just a question of seeing things, that is social reality as they really are, of throwing away the distorting spectacles of ideology. The main point is to see how the reality itself cannot reproduce itself without this so-called ideological mystification. The mask is not simply hiding the real state of things. The ideological distortion is written into its very essence. So this is something that we get in Baudrillard and then other thinkers about Guy Debord, thinking about the fact that ideology itself, it's not simply the throwing off of a false consciousness, but rather that there's something in ideology's core that makes this kind of binary between ideology and I think the term that ZIZEK uses is social reality, things as they really are, that's not such an easy distinction to make. That ideology, the way it mystifies things, the ideological distortion, that this is actually part of the way things really are.
Yes. And let me go ahead and pull it up here. So, all right. Here's what I have here. I tried to simplify this a bit. So we've got Marx in the traditional way to critique ideology, and he's got within ideology there's going to be some type of misrecognition of some premises, and realizing that misrecognition will dissolve it. That's like a classical form, and that's like page 24. And then he gets into this Frankfurt where they say, well, like you said, we're going to expound. And they're preoccupied with how does it reproduce. So the Frankfurt School says within ideology, there's also this attribute of reproduction, which involves misrecognition. And when you critique the procedure, you're dealing with how the reproduction itself is masked. And so he kind of uses I think you pronounce his name Sloterdijk. Yeah, he uses that. He uses his critique of cynical reason to try to say, and there's a little back and forth here, so it's a paradox. normal. So the normal way of critiquing ideology or knowing about ideology works, but there's kind of a new ideology which has a defense against the normal critique and the normal way of dissolving ideology. The new way, and I kind of wrote some kind of notes. So he has, Sloterdijk has this idea of I don't know how you pronounce it, Cynicism, but with a K, right? And this Cynicism says, let's read some here. It represents the popular plebeian rejection of the official culture by means of irony and sarcasm, and the classical procedure is to confront the pathetic phrases of the ruling official ideology in its solemn, grave tonality with everyday banality, and to hold them up to ridicule. Right? So I kind of almost think of Jon Stewart like that. Like he's like a real, other like newscasters were kind of afraid of when Jon Stewart would review their stuff and make fun of them. But it wasn't a regular cynicism. It was like a really just powerful critique and saying, okay, let's, show all of your problems here. But in defense, the regular cynicism actually comes after that. So you can watch a Jon Stewart and say, yeah. And then, but yeah, obviously, the banks control or whatever type of thing. Obviously, you should expect for the bailouts to go to elite or whatever. You're silly, Jon Stewart, for bringing that up. We all already know that. And so there's an internal defense, and ideology now has the internal defense built in. That's our ideology. That's what I'm saying that he's saying here.
Yeah, I mean, no, I definitely agree with what you're saying. I mean, Zizek gives the example when a politician preaches the duty of platonic sacrifice. Cynicism exposes the personal gain he is making from the sacrifice of others. But of course, then when you have that supplanted by the idea of cynicism, that is the ideological defense. It's as you say, of course, a politician is also a war profiteer. But of course, the issue with that cynicism and the people who express it in thinking in an attempt at subversive thinking, this is the criticism that Zizek is leveling at Eco's novel, is that of course isn't present on the surface level of ideology, that politicians still express ideas of duty, patriotic sacrifice. Everyone, makes their own way, pulls themselves up by their bootstraps, of course, and all of these frames of belief that are in the space of ideology. And I use belief in the colloquial sense, that these premises that hide the means by which these various politicians and political actors accrue capital, that's not immediately obvious. Of course, there's a big group of people who will say, oh, of course, but that doesn't stop. It's as Zizek says, ideology that enables that, of course, right? Like they, in air quotes, they want you to say, of course. They want you to think that it's just, that's just the way it is, and to not, engage in a more rigorous form of thought about these symptoms, right? Because this cynicism is a way to explain away the symptom, that inconsistent, scandalous emergence into the thinking of ideology, an ideology, a political ideology that says, work hard and you will benefit, sacrifice for your country. Mm-hmm. And the kind of scandalous emergences are the facts that all of these kinds of calls to behave in these ways are to the benefit of the people who articulate the claims on television, or through official government channels. So basically, that's just a restatement of what you've just said, is that this cynicism is built in.
Yeah, it's built in. Now, I'm going to try to take some of what I believe he's expounded on in the For They Know Not What They Do, on the fetishism and all this stuff. So you've got ideology, which has some definition of some type of misrecognition, and this misrecognition also has a relation to what a fetish is, going all the way to Freud, and then putting some more meaning into it. So he has, and I'm just going to try to go over this really quickly. Now he's got 3 modes of what a fetish is, and the fetish is, I know, but nevertheless. Okay, so these 3 modes he has are normal, manipulative, and fetishistic. So it's bizarre that one of the modes is named fetishistic for a fetish, but the normal mode is relates to like what a traditional authority is. So he uses this example of like the traditional authority is like like the father who they're all of their powers and their potential. So he uses it's kind of like the obscene example of like if the father actually has to beat the kid, then he loses power. He's a clown. But if he doesn't, it's his power. When he doesn't have to do that, when he can just give a stare, that's the form of what traditional authority is. Mm-hmm. But this manipulative authority is when the manipulator translates, or they transfer into being manipulated. They kind of believe their own kind of lies, I should say. And then there's the fetishistic, where they're not concerned with belief at all, and there's the fetish object has value to the fetishist. So what makes this, I think, is important when he translates that into the authority. So you already heard about the traditional authority. Mm-hmm. Then there is the manipulative authority, and then there's the totalitarian authority. Just from a high level, knowing that there's 3 kinds of authority for the 3 kinds of fetish, then when you look back at this book, when he's saying, okay, here's authority in these, like what we just read through, totalitarian laughter, well, that's just the totalitarianism. That's just the last form of the fetish. And that's just the last form of authority. So you'll see him throughout this book and other books where it seems like he'll go back and forth, and then some of it seems like might be contradictory, but he's really talking about 3 different kinds of what the fetish is, and 3 different kinds of authority. And the one that he's like he's preoccupied with a lot of times is the totalitarian style, but oftentimes he's not talking about that kind. So anyways, I just want to point that out.
Yeah, no, that's definitely interesting. Yeah, I'll have to look at those subsequent texts.
Yeah. All right. I think that might be a good short overview for this. And do you have anything else?
No, not really. I mean, I think what we have, we have the last thing that ZIZEK says on page 27 in this section. Mm-hmm. It is here at this point that the distinction between symptom and fantasy must be introduced in order to show how the idea that we live in a post-ideological society proceeds a little too quickly. So, we had a very nice 3 section in our first discussion, but in this one, we're at the edge of our seats, right? Like what's the distinction between symptom and fantasy? So of course, this overview is definitely left with a bit of an ellipsis at the end, because we're getting more substance for the particular argument he's making. I'm sure. I mean, I'm going to go ahead, although I haven't read it, and assume he'll probably revisit some of the cultural references that he has made in terms of thinking about the various texts and how they represent authority. But yeah, so that seems to be a good short overview, and thinking about it in relation to the other texts. Definitely.
Oh yeah. And you said that you read the Plague of Fantasies first.
Yeah, I've read Plague of Fantasies. I've read Looking Awry, and which other one? I don't know. I've read a couple and excerpts of a couple more, but yeah, I've never read They Know Not What They Do.
Yeah, the Plague of Fantasies. I think it's the second chapter where he starts out with the Lacan quote with the knave and the jester. That's my favorite. That makes me read ZIZEK. That's my favorite chapter. That is so applicable to so many different things. It's amazing to me. So but yeah, so the part about fantasy here is going to be, after reading that, it's going to be kind of interesting to hear how you read his ideas about fantasy in here. But all right. I think we did good. I think this will be useful for other people who are trying to fight their way through this thing. So
yeah, absolutely, great.
I'll click on the stop.